Welcome to the Safe Supportive Schools Learning Collaborative Schools Training Module 2. In this second module, we will provide some foundational learning about understanding trauma and adversity. This training is being brought to you by the National Center for Safe Supportive Schools, or NCS3, which is part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Here are some shared agreements to get the most benefit out of the modules. First, participate fully by engaging in the content while also taking care of yourself. So please take a moment to minimize distractions. And then have a beginner's mind. I invite you to take on a beginner's mind by looking at the topic through a fresh lens and see what you can add to your existing knowledge base. Today's presentation can be difficult because we will be focusing on the powerful impact that trauma has on children. This material and our discussion can be emotionally loaded, regardless of our own experience. What we discussed may remind you of something upsetting that you have seen or experienced at work or in your community. And some content may even remind you of experiences from your own childhood and bring up unexpected emotions or reactions. We strive to create an ethic of care whereby we foster caring for yourself and caring for each other. Let's take a moment to engage in a silent reflection. What techniques do you use to keep yourself present and grounded when you are feeling stressed or overwhelmed? Think about what you do in your personal life as well as your professional life. By the end of today's session, you will be able to define trauma and identify at least 3 types of traumatic exposure, describe how traumatic exposure impacts brain development and learning, describe the connection between structural racism and inequity and childhood trauma, reflect on the extent of awareness related to trauma and child traumatic stress within your school, and state at least 1 action step that you and your colleagues can take to increase your awareness related to trauma and its impact on teaching and learning. In this module, we are not focusing on strategies. Rather, we are providing the foundational awareness of trauma and adversity upon which intervention strategies will be built in future modules. First, a reminder about language and why it matters. Some terms are used interchangeably during these modules, like mental and behavioral health, trauma responsive and trauma informed practices, or cultural responsiveness versus culture and equity. In this module, you will hear the terms trauma and adversity used interchangeably, but they have slightly different definitions as well, which will be discussed a little bit later. Communities often have terms or language that resonate for them. You are definitely encouraged to explore what language or terms most resonate with the communities you serve. Throughout these modules, the intention is to consistently use language that is accurate and person-centered. For example, you'll hear students who have experienced trauma, not traumatized students. Language should, at a minimum, not do harm to individuals or groups. Language should reflect the aspirational values of anti-racism, equity, resilience, and focus on assets. For example, you'll hear youth at risk of harm instead of at-risk youth, and people of color instead of racial minorities. As you pursue your career as educators and strive to support the social and emotional health and well-being of young people, it is important to acknowledge the power of your language. Inquire about the harm or healing caused by the language you use personally. Become aware of the language that your school or any institution perpetuates, and any language you approve of by virtue of your silence. Let's start by thinking about what motivates you to be part of this learning collaborative, and take a few moments to reflect on this question. Why is it important that our school community understands trauma and adversity? In the previous module, we discussed the MTSS framework illustrated by a 3-tiered triangle. This graphic comes from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, also known as the NCTSN, which uses this framework for creating, supporting, and sustaining trauma-informed schools. We'll dive deeper into this framework later when we talk about whole school approaches to addressing the impact of trauma. Today's session is intended to lay the foundation for why these types of whole school multi-tiered approaches are so needed. For example, Tier 1 emphasizes the importance of creating safety in the environment, which is important for all students and staff, but crucial for those who have experienced traumatic stress. Tier 2 strategies target the identification and early intervention of students who are at risk of or have been exposed to trauma. And Tier 3 focuses on providing intensive trauma-specific supports to students and their families. As a place to start, let's define what trauma is. A widely accepted definition of trauma can be broken down into the 3 E's. First, an individual experiences a painful or distressing event. There are a wide range of types of events that individuals can experience, which we'll talk about shortly. However, the event alone is not enough to meet the definition of trauma. For the second E, the individual will experience an intense and prolonged stress response as a result of the event. They may feel terrified during the event, and the stress response continues long after the event has ended. It is important to note that different individuals will have different responses to the same events, and also that all individuals will not experience the same events as trauma. Some people will be more resilient than others in response to the same experiences. Finally, the event and the individual's experience of the event produces effects, the third E, that last beyond the immediate aftermath. It's very common for someone to experience an acute distress response in the first 2 to 3 months after something stressful or frightening occurs. These symptoms often go away with adequate support and time. However, physical and emotional symptoms that last beyond that period are signs that the person is experiencing ongoing distress and may need additional support. We will talk more about what these signs look like, especially in the school setting in future modules. To understand trauma, we must consider the event, the experience that an individual has of the event, and the resulting physical and emotional effects. As stated earlier, a traumatic event can take many different forms. It can be a single event, like a serious accident or injury, or it can be a chronic experience, such as ongoing physical abuse or neglect. It can be a traumatic event that only one directly experiences, but can also occur when one witnesses or is exposed to the event, such as having seen it occur, seeing graphic images of it, or being told about it. This is significant when considering secondary traumatic stress. The emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the firsthand trauma experiences of another, which we will discuss at a greater length in a learning session that comes later. Traumatic events can be natural in origin, such as floods, hurricanes, and earthquakes, or they can be man-made disasters such as war, school shootings, and bombing attacks. Trauma can occur in the context of communities, such as a natural disaster that affects an entire community. Some community-level traumatic events, such as community violence, result from inequitable systems and structures. And trauma can also occur in the context of more intimate relationships, such as experiencing domestic violence. And finally, trauma can occur in the context of present day, or can be intergenerational or historical, such as racist systems and structures that remain as the legacy of genocide, slavery, and other forms of historical oppression. Think about what types of trauma you've experienced in your community, in their homes, or in school. They can include assault, experiencing racism, or living through a tornado. In addition, your students may have experienced trauma related to the COVID-19 pandemic or police brutality and civil unrest that our communities are facing. The prevalence of exposure to potentially traumatic events is startling. More than 2/3 of children and youth in a nationally representative sample reported at least one potentially traumatic event by the age 16. This included events such as exposure to interpersonal violence, accidents, disasters, life-threatening illnesses, and the unexpected death of a loved one. Moreover, African American and Hispanic youth report significantly higher rates of witnessing violence relative to their Caucasian counterparts, regardless of income. It is important to remember that exposure is not enough to cause significant impairment over time. Remember the 3 E's we discussed earlier. In the first study, although more than 2/3 of children experienced a potentially traumatic event, only 13.4% of those exposed to a potentially traumatic event showed symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress. However, those that were exposed to multiple traumas or had experienced other types of family adversity or had pre-existing anxiety symptoms were the ones most likely to show the third E, those long-lasting effects. Now think about what this means in your classroom. Let's say you have a classroom of 30 students. That means that approximately 20 of them have been or will be exposed to a traumatic event by the time they turn 60 years old. Take a few moments to reflect on the following questions. How aware are you about the types of traumatic events your students may have been exposed to? And number 2, how aware are you of the prevalence and impact of trauma among students in your school?